Hello everybody, welcome back to Psychology 32, Lifespan Development. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 8, Early Childhood Biosocial Development. So when we talk about early childhood, we're talking about the ages of 2 to 6, give or take, and we're going to talk about physical development that happens in those ages. The topics for this lecture are going to include brain growth, motor skill development, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, injury, levels of injury prevention, and warning signs of maltreatment. Okay, first, basic things that happen to a child between the ages of 1 and 6 or 2 and 6. They become slimmer, again, relative to their body size before, and they don't actually lose weight. They're going to continue to put on weight, but they look slimmer because of their proportional change. Their lower body lengthens, fat gets replaced with muscles. The belly tends to flatten, the limbs lengthen, the head becomes more proportional, and they get taller and heavier. Typical 6-year-old is at least 3.5 feet tall, and remember there are ranges, right? Some can be less, some can be more, but is usually about 3.5 feet tall, or at least 3.5 feet tall, weighs between 40 and 50 pounds. They typically look lean, and they have adult-like body proportions. And when I say adult-like body proportions, I'm talking about head to torso ratio, torso to leg ratio, so overall length versus size of the different body structures. Okay, the brain grows very, very rapidly, even before birth, but by age 2, the brain has increased in both size, but has gone through a lot of pruning and an increase in the number of dendrites. Okay, so pruning is where the neurons that aren't being used die off. Dendrites are those little finger-like things at the ends of the neurons that receive information. And the more dendrites on a neuron, the more easily that neuron will respond to stimuli. So more dendrites, more receptive, the better the brain communicates. A 2-year-old's brain weighs about 3/4 of what it weighs in adulthood. And one big change in this early childhood stage is an increase in what we call myelin, or an increase in myelination. Myelin is the fatty tissue that surrounds and protects the axon of the neuron. What the myelin does is it speeds up the transmission of information between neurons, or across neurons, I should say. More myelin, faster information gets back and forth within the brain. The faster the information gets back and forth, the faster the individual can process and respond to information. Basically, the faster they can think. The faster they can think, the faster they can react, which means they become more efficient at a lot of things. It's not just efficiency of thinking. It's not just efficiency of saying something to the child and having the child be able to interpret and process that thing and then respond to it. Increased myelin also increases body movement, coordination. This is where kids start to perform better at sports. And you'll see between this 2 to 6 year range that kids' ability to play sports and increase in movement-related activities basically improves dramatically. They run better, they jump higher and longer, right? They can start to take on tasks, right? They can start jumping rope now, and they can start skipping, and they can start hopping, and doing all those things that really, prior to the age of 2, were very, very difficult. Now, because the brain can process information better, send information back and forth, they can think differently, and they can do a lot of things better that they weren't able to do before. Okay. One part of the brain that goes through tremendous development at this age is something called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is an area of the brain that basically connects the two halves. So let me see if I can find a couple of pictures for you to show you what the corpus callosum looks like. So if we were to look at an image of the brain from above, so this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain, left, right. This area of the brain is completely intact. This would be the left hemisphere, and this is what it would look like from above. This is the right hemisphere. What basically this drawing is trying to illustrate is if you were literally to just scoop away this part of the brain, just pare it down or cut it off, and go a few layers in, what you'll see is connective tissue, right? This section right here. This connective tissue is called the corpus callosum. It's the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres. It connects the left and the right hemisphere. Now, the corpus callosum has a number of different functions. One of the main functions of the corpus callosum is to send information back and forth. So the two different halves of the brain are responsible for different things. The left half of the brain, it controls the right half of the body. The right half of the brain controls the left half of the body. But the left half of the brain is responsible for what we would call more logic-based functions. The left half of the brain is responsible for verbal skills. It's typically responsible for more mathematical skills, where the right part of the brain is responsible for visual recognition and processing. It's responsible for scanning the environment and taking in information, for detecting upright faces. So they're responsible for two different things. Now, the interesting thing is that the corpus callosum can send information back and forth. But not only does it send information back and forth, it also is responsible for tamponading the functioning of one half of the brain over the other. Meaning that we constantly have activity within our brain, within both sides of our brain. Okay? One side is saying, do this, the other side is saying, do that. And these pieces of information tend to compete with each other. So, for example, let's say you look at somebody who's threatening, somebody who's going to attack you. The right half of the brain is responsible for recognizing this person's face, identifying who they are. The left half of the brain might be responsible for, processing information, like verbal cues. So understanding exactly what they're saying and processing that and interpreting that and responding. And the right is, again, responsible for visual processing of movement, etc. If this person is attacking you and they're reciting Shakespeare at the same time, and you have to respond, do you really think that when they're attacking you, you'd be able to memorize the Shakespeare? You can't. You have to focus on their attacking you. You have to focus on dealing with the threat and responding to the threat. So when that happens, what would happen is that you'd have information coming from both sides. The right side would be saying, hey, this person's threatening you, this person's charging you, get out of the way, do something. The left side would be saying, oh, that's a beautiful sonnet by Shakespeare, one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And in essence, your brain has to figure out what to do. Your brain can only respond to one of these at a time. It can't do both, right? Your brain has limited amounts of energy, limited amounts of attention and concentration that it can use in order to respond to the environment. So which one do you think the brain is going to give more power to or more emphasis to? It's going to give more emphasis to the right side in that case. So you won't be able to process the Shakespearean sonnet that this person is saying as they're coming at you. You'll only be able to process the threat, whatever's looking at you, whatever's coming towards you. And if that's the case, basically what's going to happen is that the corpus callosum, which again is responsible for communicating the two halves, the corpus callosum is going to basically ignore what's coming from the left half of the brain and focus on what's coming from the right half of the brain. It's going to tamponade that information. It's going to shut it down. That ability to shut it down makes the brain more efficient with its functioning. It makes it easier for the brain to process information and to focus on the information that's important and weed out or tune out the information that's not important. I'm going to pause the video for a second so I can go back to the slide deck. The other thing that the corpus callosum does is, because it sends information back and forth more easily, is it does a much better job at controlling movement in the body. It sends information back and forth. So the left half tells the right half what the left half is doing, what the right half is doing, and the right half tells the left half what the left half is doing. Let me make it a little more sense. Left half of the brain controls the right half of the body. Right half of the brain controls the left half of the body. Don't know why. It's just does. That's the way that it works. And so, in essence, if I move my right arm, the information goes in from my right arm all the way up to the left side of my brain. and then goes to the right side of my brain so that the right side of my brain knows what the right side of my body is doing. And then it goes back out the left side of the brain, down through the body, out to the right side of the body, and vice versa. If that information goes back and forth slowly, it slows the coordination of movement and processing. If the information goes back and forth quickly, obviously it processes it more quickly. That being said, the more well-developed the corpus callosum is, the faster it can send information back and forth. The faster it sends information back and forth, the more coordinated the child is. Okay? All right. Now, another area that goes through rapid development at this age is something called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the front of the brain, the area of the brain that's responsible for more complicated thinking, anticipation, and planning. So the area of the brain that says, don't do this because this is what might happen later. Don't yell at your boss today, even though you're mad at your boss, because guess what? Later, when you're potentially up for promotion, they might not give it to you. Even though you might want to yell at them now, think about what this is going to do later. The area that says, don't get a tattoo of something profane across the front of your face. It might seem cool now at a party, but in 10 years when you go to, interview at Google, this might not carry over very well. This is the area of the brain that's responsible for anticipation and planning. And limit impulsive behavior, limit the tendency to do things without thinking them through. So this is where children develop a higher level of self-control. Now, the prefrontal cortex doesn't develop fully at this age. Newer research actually says it continues to develop all the way through until the age of about 25. But this is where it begins to develop rapidly. Okay. Now, I said this before, as the corpus callosum develops, that area connecting the two halves of the brain, the coordination and body control tends to improve and tends to get better. Okay? Gross motor movement or motor skills, large body movements of the head, the arms, and the legs, tend to improve dramatically by the age of 5. And fine motor movements, they tend to be a little bit more difficult to master, fingers and toes, but they also continue to develop at this age. Now, let's talk a little bit about injury. Okay, one of the biggest problems between the ages of 2 to 6 is accidental death or injury, particularly 1 to 4-year-olds. There's a reason for this. And the reason, well, there's a couple of reasons for it actually, but the main reason for this is that the child now has the ability to start to do things that the child wasn't able to do before. I told you before, they're more coordinated, they're more proportional, they can run faster, they can jump higher, they can do more things than they were able to do before. Now, being able to do more things than they were able to do before is fantastic, right? Because they can try new things and they can experiment, but there's a downside to this. And the major downside to this is they can get into more trouble, right? And I don't mean getting into trouble as in being yelled at. I mean, they can get themselves into more dangerous situations. You don't really worry about a 6-month-old climbing the cabinets. I mean, obviously, you want to secure the cabinets. Obviously, you want to make sure that there aren't things that are dangerous at their level, but you're not as worried about the 2-year-old climbing on top of the kitchen counter, climbing up the window, opening the screens, and then climbing out and standing on a ledge that's 6 stories up. Again, obviously, lock all your windows and doors, make sure the child is safe, but that's not as likely of an outcome. The 5-year-old can certainly climb up the counter and can figure out how to unlatch the lock on a window and open the window and climb through the window and stand on the ledge. The problem is that the 5-year-old or the 4-year-old doesn't have the area of the brain that's well developed enough that says, what are you going to do once you get out on the ledge and you can't get back in? What are you going to do when you get out on the ledge if you can't balance on the ledge or if a strong gust of wind comes? That area of the brain is not well developed. that thinking forward part of the brain is not well developed, right? The prefrontal cortex. It starts to develop, but certainly not well developed enough. So that impulsivity is there, the ability to get into trouble is there, but the ability to think it through and think about what the consequences are is not necessarily there. So this is where a lot of children have injuries. Oh, I can put on my skates. Oh, and fantastic, mommy and daddy have the whole big banister that goes down the stairs in the basement. Maybe if I put my skates on, I can climb on the banister and roll all the way down the banister. How cool would that be? So they put their skates on, they open the basement door, they go to skate down the banister, and guess what? They didn't think about what happens if their skates slip off the banister, or if they lose their balance and fall, and then, roll all the way down a flight of wooden or concrete stairs. They didn't think about that. And they end up developing severe or possibly even life-threatening injuries. Okay? This can be a very dangerous age, right? We talk about baby proofing when the baby is crawling, and obviously that's very, very important. But the child is no safer at this age when they can start to get themselves into real physical trouble or real danger. All right? They move quickly. And without, missing a second, this child is gone, right? They're just going to go, right? You'll turn your back in 1 second, and they're 3 rooms away or out at the front door. Okay, so this is an area this is an age that you have to be very, very careful with. Okay, all right. We talked about why small children have so many accidents, and we mentioned that. So let's keep going. Injury prevention. Okay, we talk about injury prevention. We talk about what it sounds like: preventing injury. Okay, injury prevention is anything that we do to make injuries less likely. Okay, now we have primary prevention, secondary prevention, and then tertiary prevention. Okay, tertiary prevention is kind of a misnomer because tertiary prevention doesn't really prevent an injury. It basically deals with an injury once it's happened and prevents it from getting worse. So, primary prevention. Primary prevention basically makes all types of injuries less likely. So if you're talking about primary prevention, this might be putting your child in a situation where they ultimately don't put themselves in a position where there's any particular injury threat at all. So primary prevention might be, making sure that your house is secure, right? Making sure that your front doors are locked so the child can't, walk out into the street in a busy neighborhood. It might be training your child to not talk to strangers, okay? So that your child is not as susceptible to kidnapping. Secondary injury prevention is dealing with specific risks. So something like, let's say you live on a high floor in an apartment. A specific risk in that case is falling out of a window. So secondary injury prevention would be preventing that specific risk. So in that case, you might put guards on your windows so that way, if the child is accessing the window, they can't fall out of it. So secondary injury prevention is preventing or dealing with a specific risk that's specific to that situation. So in this case, let's say you live on a very busy street. So this might be putting a locking gate around your front yard so the child can't walk into the middle of that particular busy street. That's secondary prevention, dealing with a specific risk. Tertiary prevention is basically preventing the injury from getting worse. Tertiary injury prevention is basically when you have had an injury and you take steps to reduce the progression of that injury. So this is something where, let's say the child has, hopefully not, but let's say the child's fallen and hit their head and they're bleeding. So now so tertiary prevention would be, putting pressure on the bleed, taking the child to the hospital to get stitches if they need, if they hit their head very hard, right? Telling the physician and making sure that if they need a CAT scan or anything like that, that's taken care of. That's tertiary injury prevention. Okay, prevention that reduces the severity of the injury and hopefully staves off or reduces any permanent disabilities that would come with the injury. Okay, now we're going to talk about something a little, not a little bit more serious, but something that's very, very serious. Some of you are going to go into the healthcare professions, nurses, occupational therapists, physical therapists. Some of you are going to become teachers. When we talk about maltreatment, what we're really talking about is abuse or deprivation. Okay, so meaning an assault in some way, physical or verbal, or depriving the child of something. And when I say depriving, I mean food, shelter, warmth, etc. Okay, so when we talk about maltreatment, we're talking in essence about abuse. Now, many of you who are going into, if you're going into the healthcare profession, if you're a provider, or if you're going into teaching or education and you're a provider, you're going to be a mandated reporter, meaning that you will be legally required to report instances of suspected abuse, instances of suspected maltreatment. Okay? So basically what that means is if you think something's happening, you have to say something. It's not you should, it's you have to. You are legally required to say something. Okay, because the belief system is that the child is not able and does not understand how to report things themselves. They might be afraid, they might be uncomfortable, and so your role as the caregiver is to report on behalf of the child to make sure that the child is okay. Okay? Now, what I'm going to go through here are some indications of the possibility that maltreatment is happening. None of these are definite. None of these guarantee that the child is being abused in some way. But these are things to notice. These are things to pay attention to, and things that you might have to consider reporting because they're atypical, they're uncommon, and they could be dangerous. Again, none of these is a guarantee that the child is being maltreated. But at the same time, if you suspect something is going on, you need to say something. You need to call Child Protective Services or ACS, Association of Child Services. They keep changing the name of this organization, but you need to say something, and you can make an anonymous call. And look, nobody loves ACS. Nobody thinks they're the best organization in the world. I'm not saying they're bad or good. I know they're overworked, and I know that they try. And the goal of ACS is to help people. Okay? It's not meant to be a punitive organization. But if you suspect that something's wrong, then you have to report it. Let your supervisor know. Contact ACS, but you have to report it if you suspect that something is going on. All right, so we're going to go through some common warning signs of maltreatment or abuse. Some things that we typically notice that might be indicators of abuse. No guarantees, but these might be indicators of abuse. First, understand that abuse affects the child in every way. It affects the child cognitively, emotionally, physically, socially. It affects the child every single way. So one of the indicators of potential abuse, or one of the things that we tend to see, I should say, in children who are abused or neglected, are delays or impacts in physical, social, cognitive functioning. Now again, it's not that we are always going to look for abuse, wherein, if the child is not very social, clearly they're being assaulted at home. I don't want to set the precedent for that, because that's not always the case. It's not even likely the case. There are 1,000 different reasons why the child might not be as social as other children. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're abused. But if there's no other explanation is viable, there's certainly something to think about, certainly something to pay attention to. Okay, so a couple of things that maltreatment can impact. Delayed development, slow growth, immature communications, lack of curiosity, or unusual social interactions. All right, the kid is not functioning as well interpersonally. Slow growth is typically a sign of severe malnourishment or severe deprivation. And that doesn't mean if you have a small kid in the class they're abused, right? But children who are severely abused or severely deprived will start to grow more slowly, and they'll fall behind. During the play years, so 2 to 6, The child might seem fearful. They might be anxious or jumpy. They might be defensive. They might be aggressive. They might have a hard time telling the difference between play and reality. And again, this is where it gets hard, because there are a lot of children that have a difficult time telling the difference between fantasy or play and reality. That happens. It's not uncommon. But this can be more frequent in children that are victims of abuse. By school age, so talking now closer to 6, neglected children tend to be withdrawn. They tend to be self-critical. They can be aggressive. They don't do well with stress. And they tend to be more isolative. They tend to have fewer friends. Okay, and again, these aren't guarantees. If you're seeing a kid like this, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're abused, but these are certainly things that tend to be correlated with abuse. Okay, now, certain things to be mindful of, certain things that you'll see. Okay, injuries that don't fit an accidental explanation. Bruises on both sides of the face, burns with clear lines defining the burn, clear borders. What I mean is that kids get burned. They spill things on themselves. They touch things that are too hot, and their fingers and their hands, things like that, their elbows. And when you get a burn like this, it tends to be a broad burn without a clear shape or a clear outline. And that's not to say that they can't have a burn with a clear outline. They can. But again, that's not likely. But if you have a burn that looks exactly like the shape of, let's say, an iron, and it's clearly delineated, and it's in the palm of their hand, let's say, kid will grab an iron, and they'll realize it's hot, and they let go. And the iron doesn't have time to burn a clear iron shape in it. It's just a red sort of mark on their hand. But if a parent were abusing a child and using the iron as a punishment, they would sit there and hold the iron in place for a certain amount of time. Okay, I'm not saying this happens all the time, right? But there are instances of abuse where this has been documented. And so you'll see a clear outline of the iron shape. And that's something that's atypical. You'll see parents, there are stories about parents heating up objects and using them to burn the child, or putting a cigarette out on the child. And you'll get a very clear, round cigarette mark, not, a burn that's sort of tends to be diffuse or spread out. Okay? These are all things that are atypical, uncommon, and things that should raise red flags. Injuries that are uncommon, right? So injuries to the lower back, injuries to the torso. Again, these things happen, but they're not that common. The more common types of injuries that we see with children are, scabs on the hands, on the knees, on the elbows, even on their face, right? It's okay for a kid to have a scab on his forehead, his nose, and his chin, or her forehead, her nose, her chin. Kids run with their hands in their pockets. They forget to take their hands out, so they fall, and they fall right smack on their face. But if you're getting, injuries, on both cheeks. So if you're running and you fall, you'll fall on the right side of your face, or the left side of your face, or the front of your face. It's not common that you're going to fall and you'll fall on your left cheek, and then halfway through the fall, you'll turn your face to the right side, and then your right cheek scrapes as well, equally as much, right? That's not common. So those are certainly things that are warning signs. It's hard to get bruises on the thighs. It happens, especially on the inner thighs, right? Think about a way in which you would fall where you would get bruises on the insides of your thighs. It's very difficult to do. It's almost impossible. If the kid is very, very athletic, playing lots of sports, let's say football or soccer, maybe this will happen. But even then, it's not that likely. So if you're seeing bruises like this or marks like this, it's atypical and it doesn't really make sense. And it's stuff to pay attention to. Injuries that tend to repeat. Broken bones that tend to break again and again. Now again, there are children that are very involved in, let's say, gymnastics, and it's common that these children will get stress fractures in their feet, maybe breaks in their ankles and things like that. But if you have a kid who keeps breaking their calf, and it doesn't ever seem to heal right and things like that, it's stuff to pay attention to. Okay? fantasy play, where children are playing with dominant themes of sexual violence or just violence in general. These aren't things that are common in children that are between the ages of 2 and 6. Children that grow very slowly or have an unusual appetite or a lack of appetite, again, these are anxious children, children that are afraid all the time. They might have been deprived at home, they're not used to eating regular meals, or what we call somatic complaints. Children that have pain in their genitals, children that have that are constantly complaining about stomach aches or headaches or body aches, right? Again, kids will do this for attention sometimes. Kids will do this, to get out of things if they think that saying something or doing something like this will get them out of something they don't want to do. That happens. But if this is a child that tends to be demonstrating somatic complaints all the time, always seem to be complaining about some body illness or body pain in some way with no real explanation, and it doesn't seem like they're doing this for any type of attention, and it doesn't seem like they're doing this for malingering purposes, meaning to get out of something or for personal gain, it's stuff to pay attention to. Okay, and again, none of this is 100%. I'm not saying if a kid comes into a classroom 3 days in a row and complains of a stomach ache, you need to start calling ACS. It happens, right? Some kids will have stomach pain and stomach aches repeatedly. But at the same time, if there's no other reasonable explanation, this is stuff to pay attention to. Okay, so continuing on the indications of maltreatment. Forgive the video if it's a little bit jumpy because I've paused it a few times as I've been recording it because of interruptions. But continuing on the path, so reluctance to talk, to play, or to move, especially if development is slow. Okay. Few or no close friendships, hostility towards other people, possibly even bullying. Okay. Again, these are commonly correlated with maltreatment or neglect, but none of these are 100% guarantee one way or another. Okay, hypervigilance with quick impulsive reactions such as cringing, startling, or hitting. So if we think about it, if you've taken abnormal psychology, you probably know some of the symptoms of PTSD. If you haven't, basically some of the symptoms of PTSD are the ones that are listed here. Hypervigilance, meaning being very, very aware of things or too aware of the surroundings, always looking around, checking things, basically acting as though you're in a dangerous situation all the time, just trying to figure out where the danger is coming from, right? With your eyes darting back and forth, really, focusing in on different things. So that's hypervigilance, quick impulsive reactions, cringing, startling, etc., hitting, right? All of these things are commonplace with PTSD. And if you think about a child that's been abused or neglected or maltreated, of course their behaviors are going to emulate behaviors of PTSD, and they might even have PTSD. Okay. Frequent absences from school, changes of address, or new caregivers, right? So, this person might have moved many, many times because it's possible that in a previous school, the parents realize that the school might have been onto them, or somebody in the school is onto them, that they might potentially be abusing their child. So they packed up and moved, went to a different school district, went to a different state, right? So these are all, again, indicators of the possibility of abuse or maltreatment. And then lastly, expressions of fear rather than joy on seeing the caregiver. Again, and I can't stress enough, none of these are guarantees that a child's being abused, right, or maltreated. None of them are 100%. None of them are something that you immediately need to call the police about. But if you're seeing these things, pay attention. If you're seeing these things, let a supervisor know. And it might be worth calling ACS, and you can make an anonymous call to ACS, and you can say, these are some of the things that I'm seeing. These are some of the things that I'm concerned about. Do I need to make an official call and file an official complaint? And they're usually fairly helpful there. I mean, obviously you always hear horror stories about ACS or Child Protective Services, where they didn't respond, or they responded too harshly or too severely. It happens, right? But again, it's the difference between Or it might be the difference between, you know, saving a child's life versus not doing what you should do. Okay, so with that, you know, when in doubt, talk to a supervisor, and document things as much as you can. Right, you want to document what you did. And, you know, one of my supervisors actually gave really good advice when it came to taking notes, was document the rationale, right? Document what your thought process was behind it. So let me give you an example. So let's say you decided not to call ACS. Let's say you saw a child, you know, with bruises, and you decided not to call ACS. So they had bruises on the shins and on the ankles repeatedly, and sometimes they came in limping. And let's say this is a kid you knew well, and you knew their family. You might document something like, you know, I know the child very, very well, and being familiar with his or her family, I know that the child was involved in a lot of after-school sports, specifically soccer. I know that they were on, you know, a league after school. Don't make this stuff up. I'm speaking hypothetically. And, you know, the injuries seem consistent with a soccer injury or with injuries that would come along with soccer. And there was nothing out of the ordinary other than that. So I didn't call, you know, ACS because it didn't seem like there was anything atypical, dangerous, or abnormal going on in some way. Okay. Again, you know, documenting is going to be your best friend in a lot of ways. So just something to be mindful of.